Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 1 of this series entitled Pro Wrestling in 1990. I'm your host, Corey Vautour. You might know me from a couple of other podcasts that I do, Wrestling with the Bros and the Unofficial Buss is Your Senior Hockey League podcast. And I basically wanted to explain a little bit how this show is going to work. The series is Pro Wrestling in 1990. I'm going to be covering all the big companies and some smaller companies as well. It'll focus on one wrestler specifically in each company, but it doesn't mean we're not going to cover most important things that happened in each company that year. Like in the WWF, we're going to focus mostly on the Ultimate Warrior, but we're still going to talk about the big feuds, the tag team champions, the intercontinental champions, and the important things that happened in that company. Now, like my logo says, strictly wrestling, strictly my opinion. It is no secret to anybody that knows me that my all-time favorite wrestler is the Ultimate Warrior. He is pretty much the reason I started this YouTube channel, to basically celebrate his world title reign that I feel is one of the greatest world title reigns in the history of the wrestling business. You might not agree with me on everything I say. I'm not going to be offensive about anything. There are some wrestlers that I personally don't like, but that's just me. I'm still going to cover a lot of these guys. I might not cover them hardcore like I'm going to do the Ultimate Warrior, but I'm going to do the best job I can, and I hope you guys enjoy this first episode covering the WWF. And we are going to start in January 1990. To start 1990, the champions are Hulk Hogan is the WWF World Heavyweight Champion. The tag team champions are the Colossal Connection. That's Andre the Giant and Haku, managed by Bobby Heenan. And the Intercontinental Champion is the Ultimate Warrior. A feud going into 1990 that was supposed to happen at the Royal Rumble, but for whatever reason it was scrapped and it was put on a special pay-per-view, was the no holds barred steel cage match between Hulk Hogan and Brutus the Barber Beefcake versus Zeus and Macho King Randy Savage. And this pay-per-view would basically be the steel cage tag team match and the movie No Holds Barred. After that, Zeus would leave the WWF and we would basically never hear from Zeus again, but he would have that final match on a special pay-per-view. Going into the Royal Rumble, some minor feuds happening. The Ultimate Warrior is feuding with Dino Bravo and Earthquake. That would tie into WrestleMania VI and his feud with Hogan coming up. Demolition and the Colossal Connection are feuding. Jake the Snake Roberts and Ted DiBiase are feuding. I think their segment happens either before or after the Royal Rumble. It doesn't happen at the Rumble, though. A couple of the undercard matches at the Royal Rumble were Brutus the Barber Beefcake versus the Genius, and he would actually cut the Genius's hair at the Rumble, and that would be like a running gag for the rest of the year almost. Also, Greg the Hammer Valentine and Rugged Ronnie Garvin would have a submission match. This would basically end their feud. And then there's the Royal Rumble match itself. This Royal Rumble match doesn't get enough credit for being one of the all-time great Royal Rumble matches. It's remembered for one moment, which is the moment I remember it for, the first meeting between the Ultimate Warrior and Hulk Hogan, when they eliminate everybody in the ring. There's more people to come down, but at the moment, they're just the only two in the ring. They've eliminated everybody. They slowly turn towards each other, and the place just goes unglued. It's one of those moments in wrestling that I remember so well. Just an epic encounter in the Royal Rumble match. They hit the ropes a few times, and then they hit each other with a double clothesline. So now they're both down. Now other guys are coming out. I think Rick Rude and the Barbarian and Mr. Perfect. There was a big rumor going into the Royal Rumble that Mr. Perfect was supposed to win this one, and Hulk Hogan basically ixnayed that and decided he was going to go over. So at one point in the match, the Ultimate Warrior is about to be eliminated by, I think, the Barbarian and Rick Rude, when Hogan double clotheslines them and helps them eliminate the Ultimate Warrior by accident. Warrior then jumps back into the ring and just nails all the heels. Doesn't touch Hogan though, then gets out of the ring, runs to the back. The final two competitors in the Royal Rumble match would be Hulk Hogan and Mr. Perfect. Hulk Hogan would eliminate Mr. Perfect, and he would win the Royal Rumble in 1990. I've never been a Hulk Hogan fan. I think somebody else could have won, like Mr. Perfect, or even the Ultimate Warrior. He's going to be in the main event of WrestleMania, but Mr. Perfect really deserved it, and he didn't get it, and It's a bummer. 1 week later, the Ultimate Warrior and Hulk Hogan would actually team up to take on Mr. Perfect and the Genius. This is actually a match that I know very well. When I was a kid, my uncle actually recorded this Saturday night's main event, and it was in my VHS collection. The ending of the match is what you would expect. It's an Ultimate Warrior and Hulk Hogan victory. As their hands are raised by the referee, Genius and Mr. Perfect would actually attack Hulk Hogan, knock him out of the ring. The Ultimate Warrior would fend off both guys, would start hitting them with punches and clotheslines, but Hulk Hogan would come into the ring and sneak up on the Warrior, and Warrior would clothesline him by accident. Warrior would then try to help up Hogan, and as Hogan is getting up, he shoves the Warrior. So now another war has begun. In the coming weeks, it would be announced that the Ultimate Warrior and Hulk Hogan would meet at WrestleMania 6. But which title would be on the line? Would it be the World title? Would it be the Intercontinental title? I felt that this suspense on which belt it's going to be really helped this storyline big time. And it needed no help. It was a fantastic storyline. But in the end, it would be announced that both the WWF World Heavyweight title and the Intercontinental title would be on the line. Champion versus champion, title for title. This was the ultimate challenge. The weeks leading up to WrestleMania 6, they would both cut promos, almost biblical promos. Really, really good stuff. They would also come to each other's aid as Earthquake would try to give the Earthquake splash to the Ultimate Warrior off the second rope. Hogan would come in, help the Ultimate Warrior. Then they would shove each other and not get along. A few weeks later, Earthquake was beating up on Hogan, was about to give him the Earthquake splash, but Ultimate Warrior would come out, clothesline him, and he would actually try to help up Hulk Hogan, but Hogan would keep pushing him away. So Warrior starts running the ropes and he's about to clothesline Hogan, and then he stops. And they both look at the crowd. The crowd erupts. And then Warrior leaves the ring, runs to the back, and we're off to WrestleMania 6. But before we get into WrestleMania 6, a few of the things happening elsewhere in the company. Jake the Snake Roberts was in possession of Million Dollar Man Ted DiBiase's $1 million belt. And Ted DiBiase actually hired the Big Boss Man to get his belt back. Boss Man had been told that he is retrieving stolen property for Ted DiBiase, but when he saw that Ted DiBiase had paid off Slick, Big Boss Man was not happy with that. So he returned the belt and the pet snake Damien to Jake the Snake Roberts. The Big Boss Man turned babyface in the process. At WrestleMania 6, Ted DiBiase would face off against Jake the Snake Roberts for the $1 million belt, and the Big Boss Man would face his former tag team partner, Akeem, who was with Slick. At the Royal Rumble, the Macho King Randy Savage and Sensational Queen Sherri would start feuding with Dusty Rhodes and Sapphire. This would be a mixed tag team match, which was a first for the WWF. Demolition would look to become a three-time tag team champions when they would take on the colossal connection of Andre the Giant and Haku. Mr. Perfect would look for revenge for his partner, the Genius, as he would take on Brutus the Barber Beefcake, who had cut the Genius's hair at the Royal Rumble. Let's get into WrestleMania 6. The first match we're going to talk about is Demolition trying to become three-time WWF World Tag Team Champions as they take on the tag team of Haku and Andre the Giant, the Colossal Connection. A bizarre match, to say the very least. Andre the Giant really never gets into the ring. Haku does the entire match. But Demolition does get the win and become three-time WWF World Tag Team Champions. Demolition is one of my all-time favorite tag teams, and I really feel like this is their last big moment. They would turn heel within the next few months, and they would introduce Crush into the team, and it wasn't the same after that. Brutus the Barber Beefcake would actually pin Mr. Perfect at WrestleMania 6, and at the end of the match, he would actually give a haircut to the Genius once again, really cutting the rest of his hair off. The first ever mixed tag team match in WWF history saw Macho King Randy Savage and Sensational Queen Sherri take on Dusty Rhodes and Sapphire, accompanied to the ring by their crown jewel, Miss Elizabeth. This match was okay match. I would have preferred a singles match between Savage and Rhodes, but it was an okay match. Dusty Rhodes and Sapphire would get the win. Sapphire would pin Sherri at the end. In what I believe was the first time ever, the $1 million championship belt would be on the line, as Jake the Snake Roberts would take on $1 million Man Ted DiBiase. An okay match. I always laugh when the Canadian crowd in Toronto starts doing the wave in the middle of this match. DiBiase would get the win by countout, winning back his $1 million belt. Now let's get into my all-time favorite match. Champion versus champion, title for title. This is the ultimate challenge. Hulk Hogan versus the Ultimate Warrior. 65,000 plus were waiting for this match, and they would not be disappointed. The Ultimate Warrior first came out running to the ring, followed by Hulk Hogan walking to the ring. Now, the reason I mention this is there were little carts taking the wrestlers to the ring, and they decided to not use the carts. Warrior wanted to run to the ring, and he did, and I see nothing wrong with that because he still had one of the best matches I've ever seen in my entire life. In fact, it is the best match in my opinion. It's rare that you can have two superstars just standing in the middle of the ring, still holding their respective titles, and the place is just going crazy. They haven't even touched yet. This is how epic this match was going to be. For you newer fans, think of the Shield and the Wyatt family when they were just looking at each other and the place was going crazy. This match was booked perfectly. It was booked like they were equals. That one would do a move, the other would do a similar move. The test of strength. Warrior breaks down Hogan, then Hogan breaks down Warrior. Just like that the entire time. The clotheslines and the double clotheslines, just amazing stuff. Near the end of the match, Hogan would send Warrior into the ropes and he would hit him with an elbow, which would send Warrior to the outside. They would brawl for a while until they would try to run each other into the ring post. It would not work and Hogan would headbutt the Warrior, but then Warrior would just grab Hogan and slam him into the ring post before throwing him into the ring. Warrior would clothesline Hogan a few times before he would go for the gorilla press. He would get him up, slam him down, then give him the big splash to the back. One, two, and Hogan kicks out. Hogan starts to hulk up. Warrior's never seen nothing like this. Hogan is getting punched by the Warrior, but he's not feeling the punches. Then all of a sudden, he blocks Warrior's punch. He starts punching Warrior a few times, throws him into the ropes, catches him with a big boot, then goes for the big leg, but he misses. Warrior gets out of the way, hits the ropes, hits a big splash. One, two, three. The Ultimate Warrior is your new WWF World Heavyweight Champion. Hogan would grab his WWF World Heavyweight title. He would get into the ring and he would present it to the Ultimate Warrior, passing the torch to the Ultimate Warrior. Both men would hug, show each other respect. Hogan would leave the ring and Ultimate Warrior would celebrate with fireworks going off. This was a real passing of the torch. And this would start off the Ultimate Warrior's legendary WWF World Heavyweight title reign. Um, to me, it is the best world title reign ever. I know not everybody's going to agree with me, but this is the one for me that I feel is the greatest of all time. And just what the Ultimate Warrior accomplished on this night. He becomes the first and to this date only man to have held the WWF World Heavyweight title and the WWF Intercontinental title at the same time. He is the first man to main event WrestleMania as the Intercontinental Champion. He's the first man to beat Hulk Hogan clean since the Hulkamania era had started all the way in the AWA in the early 80s. Just those accomplishments alone makes Ultimate Warrior top 5 all time for me. To me, he's number one. Obviously, he's my all time favorite, but yeah, I don't think he gets enough credit for what he's accomplished in the wrestling business. This match is a once in a lifetime match. This match will never be surpassed by any match that has happened or will happen. This is my number one match ever. When you think of classic WrestleMania matches, classic WrestleMania main events, this is one of the top ones. It's up there with Hogan and Andre. 13 days later, the Ultimate Warrior is in Japan for a WWF, All Japan, and New Japan Super Show. He would successfully defend the WWF World Heavyweight title versus the Million Dollar Man Ted DiBiase. This really makes Ultimate Warrior a world champion because you're defending the title in Japan. You've won it in Canada. Later on in the month, you're going to defend it in the United States in Texas. Um, he's defending it also in New Japan and All Japan. So that's an accomplishment that just blows my mind. That same month, he would defend the WWF World Heavyweight title on Saturday night's main event versus Haku of the Bobby Heenan family. He would successfully defend the title. This would start the next chapter in the Ultimate Warrior versus Bobby Heenan family rivalry, where Ravishing Rick Rude would start challenging the Ultimate Warrior, and that would lead to a match at SummerSlam. And just a little something to tie into Wrestling with the Bros. The Ultimate Warrior would actually start defending the WWF World Heavyweight title on house shows versus Mr. Perfect. And on April 30th, he would successfully defend the WWF World Heavyweight title at the Moncton Coliseum in Moncton, New Brunswick versus Mr. Perfect. I was a year old, I wasn't at the show, but that's pretty cool that one of his first title defenses is in Moncton, my hometown. Other things happening between WrestleMania and SummerSlam, the Intercontinental title would be vacated. The Ultimate Warrior could not fill both responsibilities as being a double champion, so he kept the world title, and the Intercontinental title was vacated by President Jack Tunney. A tournament would be held and won by Mr. Perfect, who would also join the Heenan family at the same time. Mr. Perfect was scheduled to continue his feud with Brutus the Barber Beefcake, but Beefcake would actually be injured going into SummerSlam, so he wouldn't wrestle for a full year at least. So, right before SummerSlam, newcomer Kerry Von Erich, known as the Texas Tornado, would take Beefcake's spot and challenge Mr. Perfect for the Intercontinental title. Demolition would start feuding with the Hart Foundation and the Rockers, and in the middle of all this, they would turn heel and introduce a third member, Crush. The main feud going into SummerSlam, though, would be the Hart Foundation, and they would also feud a little bit with newcomers to the WWF, the Legion of Doom, Hawk and Animal. After WrestleMania, Sapphire would start getting these gifts from a mystery person. Nobody would know who it would be, but she would get all sorts of things, cruises around the world, jewelry, all sorts of expensive gifts. Hulk Hogan would be attacked by Earthquake on the Brother Love show and would be injured, but he would make it back for SummerSlam to face the Earthquake. Leading up to SummerSlam, Ravishing Rick Rude would be seen training and challenging the Ultimate Warrior, saying, "I'm the only one who's ever beaten you for a title." Finally, they would have their first match on the July Saturday night's main event, where the Ultimate Warrior would successfully defend his WWF World Heavyweight title. But this was not their final battle. They would meet in the main event of SummerSlam 1990 in a steel cage. Let's get into the SummerSlam card. The first match we're going to talk about, the Texas Tornado would beat Mr. Perfect for the Intercontinental title. They would feud for the rest of the year, but the feud would not get into 1991. In a 2 out of 3 falls match, the Hart Foundation would beat Crush and Smash to win the WWF World Tag Team titles with some help from Animal and Hawk, the Legion of Doom. The Hart Foundation would spend the rest of 1990 feuding with Rhythm and Blues, Honky Tonk Man, and Greg the Hammer Valentine. A show-long storyline is the disappearance of Sapphire. She did not show up for her match with Sensational Sherry. Uh, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, Dusty Rhodes, they're all looking for her until Dusty Rhodes has to go to the ring for his match with Macho King Randy Savage. That's when the $1 Million Man would come out, and he would say everybody has a price, and Sapphire would come out. He has bought Sapphire. DiBiase and Rhodes would feud for the rest of 1990 going into 1991. Also on the card, Hulk Hogan defeated Earthquake by countout. Um, Not a big fan of this match. Just Earthquake. I don't know. This one just didn't click for me. But next up, we have the main event: The Ultimate Warrior versus Ravishing Rick Rude in a steel cage match for the WWF World Heavyweight title. Some more historical facts here. This is the first ever WWF World Heavyweight title match at a SummerSlam. This was the third SummerSlam. The two previous SummerSlams, the world champion were in tag team matches. So the Ultimate Warrior is the first man to defend the WWF World Heavyweight title at SummerSlam. In the long history of SummerSlam, the Ultimate Warrior is the first. Another reason why the Ultimate Warrior's WWF World Heavyweight title run is so legendary. The Ultimate Warrior and Rick Rude, their rivalry is top three all time for me. I think Hogan and Savage are up there for Ultimate Warrior as well, but Rick Rude is up there very close to the top because they just had a legendary rivalry for the Intercontinental title, and now they're finishing their feud for the world title and in a steel cage match, a very old school territory way of doing things. Rick Rude was the first one to come out, followed by the Ultimate Warrior, who would sprint to the ring, jump on the cage, shake the bars like he would the ropes, before getting into the ring and starting this epic war. In the middle of the match, Bobby the Brain Heenan would jump the cage and try to attack the Ultimate Warrior, but the Ultimate Warrior would catch Bobby Heenan and hit him with an atomic drop before turning around and getting hit by a clothesline by Ravishing Rick Rude. The Ultimate Warrior would make it to the ropes, start shaking the ropes. As Rude starts to attack the Ultimate Warrior would block his offense, hit him with a few clotheslines, pick him up for the Gorilla Press Slam, and then he would climb the cage to victory. The Ultimate Warrior would then climb the cage with his turquoise colored championship belt, and with a bloody face, he would lift up the World Heavyweight title for all to see. This is my favorite Ultimate Warrior title defense just for historical purposes. It's the first time it's defended at SummerSlam, and the Ultimate Warrior is the first man to do it. So, just for those reasons alone, that's my favorite Ultimate Warrior title defense. Another thing I want to talk about is Ultimate Warrior's one world title reign. He had like four or five different colored championship belts. He had a black strap belt, he had a white strap belt, a turquoise strap belt. By the Royal Rumble, he has a purple strap belt. I think that's a record for one title reign and all these belts. Once SummerSlam was over, the Ultimate Warrior would become a very busy man, having two programs at the same time. He would feud with Macho King Randy Savage over the WWF World Heavyweight title, and also team up with the Legion of Doom to take on all three members of Demolition. Survivor Series was never a show that sold really well, so their plan was basically let's have these six-man tag team matches and try to sell this pay-per-view, and it worked. The pay per view would have over 400,000 pay per view buys. Before we get to Survivor Series, though, let's get into a few of the feuds happening in the WWF. Before SummerSlam, Bobby Heenan started telling jokes about the Big Boss Man's mom, and this would keep getting worse and worse until the Big Boss Man would eventually get Bobby Heenan and handcuff him to the guardrail. This would start a feud between the Big Boss Man and Ravishing Rick Rude. Before the year is over, Rick Rude would actually leave the company, but the Big Boss Man Bobby Heenan family feud would continue all the way up to WrestleMania VII, when Big Boss Man would take on Mr. Perfect for the Intercontinental title. Jake the Snake Roberts would make an appearance on the Brother Love show, and during his appearance there, Rick Martel would accidentally spray him in the eyes with his arrogance. That would be his perfume that he would carry around. And the storyline would be Jake the Snake would be blinded in one eye. They would feud for the rest of the year. It would end in a blindfold match at WrestleMania VII. Sergeant Slaughter would make his return to the WWF in the summer. He would be a heel. He would be an Iraqi sympathizer playing off the Gulf War. And this would be the first time he'd be in the WWF in many years. He had been in the AWA since 1985, I believe. At this point in time, he's feuding with the likes of Nikolai Volkov and Hacksaw Jim Duggan. The Ultimate Warrior and Macho King Randy Savage would start their feud when Queen Sherry would call out the Ultimate Warrior on the Brother Love show with a contract saying, defend your title against the Macho King. And the Ultimate Warrior would say, I don't need a contract to defend my title against anybody. And he would take the contract and rip it right in Sherry's face. Sherry would then slap the Ultimate Warrior 3 times in the face, enraging the Ultimate Warrior. He would then storm to the back, looking for the Macho King Randy Savage, leaving destruction behind him. So let's get into the Survivor Series. This show would have a grand finale match of survival. What does that mean? So the winners of every match would meet in a final Survivor Series match at the end of the night to see who would be the ultimate survivors. So let's start off. The Warriors would take on the Perfect Team. The Warriors would be WWF World Heavyweight Champion, the Ultimate Warrior, teaming up with the Intercontinental Champion, the Texas Tornado, and teaming up with the Legion of Doom, Hawk and Animal, taking on Mr. Perfect and all three members of Demolition. The Ultimate Warrior would be the sole survivor in this match. Next match on the card, the Dream Team versus the Million Dollar Team. Dusty Rhodes, Coco Beware, and the Hart Foundation versus the Million Dollar Man Ted DiBiase, Rhythm and Blues, that's Honky Tonk Man and Greg the Hammer Valentine, and a debuting Undertaker. The sole survivor would be the Million Dollar Man Ted DiBiase. Third match on this card would see the Vipers versus the Visionaries. The Vipers would be Jake the Snake Roberts, Superfly Jimmy Snuka, and the Rockers, Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty, taking on the Visionaries, Rick the Model Martel, the Warlord, and Power and Glory. That is Hercules and Paul Roma. The survivors would be the entire team of the Visionaries. Next up would be the Hulkamaniacs versus the Natural Disasters. So Hulk Hogan teams up with Tugboat, the Big Boss Man, and Jim Duggan to take on Earthquake, Dino Bravo, Haku, and the Barbarian. Hulk Hogan would be the sole survivor. And finally, the Alliance versus the Mercenaries. The Alliance would be Nikolai Volkov, Tito Santana, and the Bushwhackers, Luke and Butch, versus Sergeant Slaughter, Boris Zukov, and the Orient Express, Sato and Tanaka. The sole survivor would be Tito Santana. So our grand finale match of survival is the Visionaries, Rick the Model Martel, the Warlord, Power and Glory, and their tag team partner now, the Million Dollar Man Ted DiBiase, versus Tito Santana, Hulk Hogan, and the WWF World Heavyweight Champion, The Ultimate Warrior. The survivors of that match would be The Ultimate Warrior and Hulk Hogan. The very next night, the main event would happen, and the Ultimate Warrior would defend his WWF World Heavyweight title against the Million Dollar Man, Ted DiBiase. He would successfully defend the title, but at the end of the match, he would be attacked violently by Macho King Randy Savage. This would set up a dark match at the end of the night that saw the Ultimate Warrior beat Macho King Randy Savage in a WWF World Heavyweight title match. There were a few dark matches that were recorded, which were Ultimate Warrior WWF World Heavyweight title defenses, that would appear on Coliseum home videotapes the following year. Matches against Mr. Perfect, Macho King Randy Savage, and Sergeant Slaughter would all be on there. Mr. Perfect would win back the Intercontinental title from the Texas Tornado with help from the Million Dollar Man Ted DiBiase. This seemed to set up a feud between Ted DiBiase and the Texas Tornado, but I don't think it went anywhere. DiBiase would continue feuding with Dusty Rhodes, and his son Dustin actually would make an appearance in October, and this would culminate at the Royal Rumble in a tag team match between Dustin Rhodes and Dusty Rhodes versus the Million Dollar Man Ted DiBiase and Virgil. Something a little funny, in the first few weeks of The Undertaker being in the WWF, he would be called Kane the Undertaker. And one of the last things I'm going to mention here is the Ultimate Warrior would defend the WWF World Heavyweight title at the Royal Rumble. He would lose that title to Sergeant Slaughter because of Macho King Randy Savage. They would have a legendary match at WrestleMania VII, which would be a retirement match, which Ultimate Warrior would win, and Randy Savage would retire for almost a year. Another notch on the Ultimate Warrior's belt, though, because he is the first man to defend the WWF World Heavyweight title at the Royal Rumble. So, in the history of the Royal Rumble, the Ultimate Warrior is the first to do it. And with that, that's the end of episode one. Like I said at the beginning, I just want to give Ultimate Warrior all the credit in the world for his WWF World Heavyweight title run. A lot of people always have negative things to say about his title reign, which I always felt was unfair. To me, it's the best world title reign ever. That's my opinion, though. You don't have to agree with me, but you gotta give the man his due. With all he accomplished in this title reign, it's more than 99% of wrestlers will ever accomplish. And I know a lot of people are going to be offended by that, but it's the God's honest truth. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope that if you weren't a fan of The Ultimate Warrior, I hope you are now. If you were already a fan of The Ultimate Warrior, I hope you really enjoyed this episode. Episode 2, we're going to be talking about WCW, or the NWA as it was back then, and my favorite WCW wrestler of all time. It's the man called Sting, the Ultimate Warrior's former tag team partner. It's crazy how they became world champion the exact same year. And we'll get into that in part 2, NWA in 1990. Hope you enjoyed this episode, and thanks for listening.